The bread was still warm. Maren could feel it through the coarse linen of her apron pocket. A small loaf, dense, barely the size of her fist, pressed against her hip like a secret she was carrying with both hands cupped around it, even though only one hand touched it, and the other was busy holding her shawl closed against the cold. She walked fast. Her boots cut through the frozen mud of the servants' corridor, and she kept her head down. Down her shoulders curved inward, as if she could fold herself into something smaller than she already was. Which she couldn't. But 6 years of trying had taught her muscles the shape of it anyway. The kitchens of Corveth Hold were loud at this hour. Steam rolled off the copper pots in white ropes. The smell of roasting fowl and scorched thyme thickened the air until it was almost a thing you could lean on. And the head cook, a broad woman named Gudrun, was shouting at 2 boys about a broth that had been salted twice and tasted. She said, like the sea had wept into it out of spite. Nobody looked at Maren. They never did. She was the girl who mopped the stone floors before the sun bothered to rise, who swept the ash from the great hearths, who hauled water from the well in buckets so heavy that her shoulders had stopped aching from them somewhere around her 2nd winter here. Her back had simply agreed to the arrangement and moved on. Invisible. That was how you survived in a place like this. You became furniture. You became a draft that moved through a room. And nobody stops a draft to ask what it's carrying. She slipped out the side door. The cold hit her like a flat hand. Outside the night was sharp and moonless, the sky a bruised gray, smeared at its lowest edge with the first threat of snow. Wind moved through the pines at the far end of the yard. The torches along the outer wall bent sideways in their iron brackets, hissing, throwing light that couldn't decide where it wanted to fall. Just get home. Just get there. She crossed the yard, past the stables where the horses shifted in their stalls and blew warm clouds into the dark, past the woodpile stacked against the wall, past the iron gate that separated the grounds of the hold from the village path below. The gate was unlocked at this hour. That was the one mercy the night handed out for free. She pulled it open, slipped through, started down the hill, and below her the village of Corveth sat in the dark, like something the mountain had coughed up long ago and never gotten around to reclaiming. A scatter of low timber houses, most of them shuttered, most of them cold. Smoke rising from only 2 or 3 chimneys, thin and grudging, and one house at the very end of the row, with no smoke rising at all. That was hers. That was where the bread was going. The path down was slick with ice, and Maren took it the way she took everything carefully. One hand braced on the low stone wall that bordered it, the other pressed flat over the loaf in her pocket. She had not eaten today, nor much yesterday, but the bread was not for her, and she had made her peace with that particular arithmetic a long time ago. She was nearly at the bottom when she heard it. Footsteps. Not the soft, uncertain steps of someone picking their way over ice in the dark. No. These were deliberate, measured, heavy in a way that had nothing to do with a man's weight and everything to do with a man's certainty. The footsteps of someone who had never once in his life needed to worry about being heard. Maren did not turn around. She walked faster, because turning around is an admission, because running is worse, because the moment you acknowledge the thing chasing you, you hand it permission to catch you. So she kept her eyes on the houses and told her legs in the firm voice she used on Cassian when he refused to sleep, not now, not yet, not here. Torvald had not meant to follow her. He had been standing at the window of the great hall. the wide-arched one that looked down over the inner yard. A cup of wine in his hand that he had not tasted watching the yard for no reason at all, except that it was something to look at that was not the faces of his council, who had spent the last 2 hours arguing about grain levies and the eastern border and a dozen other matters that all began after a while to sound like the same tired dog barking at the same tired moon. Outside was quieter. Outside asked nothing of him. And then a small figure had come out the side door. He'd recognized her distantly. The way you recognize a chair you've walked past 1,000 times without ever once sitting in it. The thin woman who cleaned the east wing before he was dressed each morning, who moved along the walls like a shadow that had been handed a mop and told to make itself useful. He noticed her the way you notice weather, but then he watched her cross the yard, and he saw the shape of her hand pressed flat against her apron. And he knew that shape. He had grown up in a keep. He knew exactly what a person looked like when they were carrying something they had no right to carry. The slight forward lean. The arm held too close to the body. The walk that was working very hard to be a stroll, and failing to be anything but a run wearing a disguise. She had taken something from his kitchens. He set the cup down. I didn't call a guard. He didn't summon his steward. He simply lifted his cloak from the back of the chair where he'd draped it, and he walked out of the great hall, down the corridor and through the side door himself into the cold. Which was a strange thing to do. I was aware, even as he did it, that it was a strange thing to do. An alpha king does not chase a thief down a hill in the dark. That is what men in livery are for. And yet here he was, breathing the cold in through his teeth, rolling his shoulders once against the chill, looking down the yard to where a small gray figure was already slipping through the gate. He followed. Marin heard the footsteps stop. She was almost to the first row of houses now, and she allowed herself one glance back. Just one. Brief. Sideways. The kind of look you tell yourself doesn't count. And what she saw closed a fist around her lungs. The man at the bottom of the path was not a guard. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark wool cloak that fell all the way to his boots, and even in the poor light of the torches at the path's mouth, she could see the quality of everything on him. The leather of his gloves, the silver clasp at his throat. The straight, unhurried way he stood like a man who had never once in his life been cold, or hungry, or afraid, and had begun to suspect those were things that only happened to other people. Torvald, the Alpha King of Corveth. She had seen him before, of course. Everyone in the hold had. But seeing him across a great hall while you swept its floors was a very different thing from standing 20 feet from him on an empty village path. Path at night with stolen bread pressed to your hip. Marin turned back around. Her legs wanted to run. Her mind said no. She kept walking. Stop. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It carried through the cold the way a stone carries through still water. Clean. Total. Impossible to pretend you hadn't heard. Marin stopped. She stood very still for a moment, her back to him, one hand flat over the bread, the other curled into a fist at her side. The wind moved through the pines above the path. Somewhere in the village a dog barked once and thought better of it. Then she turned around. She met his eyes, because there was nothing else left to do. Torvald looked at her. She was younger than he'd expected. Mid-20s, perhaps, with a face that might have been soft in some other life, but was currently arranged into something careful and composed, as though composure was the last coin she had, and she was holding it with both hands. Her dark hair was pulled back tight, a few strands loose around her face from the wind. Her shawl was doing almost nothing against the cold. and her boots. There was a crack running the length of the left sole. He could see it from where he stood. "Your pocket," he said. For a moment she didn't move, and then with a deliberate steadiness that he recognized not as courage, but as something harder than courage, the decision to hold still inside fear, she reached into her apron and drew out the bread. She held it toward him. In both hands. Just that. No excuse, no plea, no tears. Just a small, warm loaf offered back to him, flat on her open palms. Her chin lifted, her dark eyes steady on his face. Torvald looked at the bread, then at her. "Why?" he asked. Something flickered across her face. Gone before he could name it. "I was hungry," she said, and it was not the truth. He could hear it. The slight flatness of a sentence that had been built rather than remembered. The way her eyes stayed 1 degree too steady, as though she were holding them in place by will alone. He had been lied to by advisors, by nobles, by men who had spent their whole lives learning the craft of it, polishing their falsehoods until they gleamed. This woman was not a good liar, but she was a determined one. "Were you?" he said. Not a question. She didn't answer. The bread stayed in her outstretched hands, offered back to him, like a small, warm surrender. Torvald looked at her hands. They were raw from cold, and work the knuckles read the skin around her wrists chapped where her sleeves fell short. The hands of a person who worked every day, every single day, without the mercy of exception. He looked at the crack in her boot. He looked at the shawl that a strong wind would have carried off like a leaf. He looked at the bread, and then he did a thing that made no sense to him, even as he was doing it. "Keep it," he said. Marin's hands didn't move. Her careful expression cracked, just slightly, just at the corners, into something that looked almost like confusion, as though he had spoken a language she was fluent in, but had never expected to hear in this particular street. "Keep walking," he added, "and don't let me catch you in my kitchens again." He turned, started back up the path. He had gone perhaps 10 steps when something stopped him. Not a sound. The absence of one. The realization that he had not heard her footsteps resume behind him, which meant she was still standing exactly where he had left her. Bread in both hands, not moving. He didn't turn, but he stopped. And then he heard it. Barely. Carried down the wind from somewhere close. A child's cough. Small. Wet. Persistent. The kind that comes from a chest too little to hold it. And it was coming from one of those dark, shuttered houses at the edge of the village. The one with no smoke rising from its chimney. Torvald stood very still on the icy path. He thought about the bread, about the shape of her hand pressed to her apron, about the lie she had told him with her chin up and her eyes steady as stone. I was hungry. He turned around slowly. Marin was already gone. But the house at the end of the row, the one with the cracked shutter and the dark chimney, and the sound of a child coughing behind its walls, was still there. Torvald looked at it for a long moment, and then he followed. The door had no lock. That was the first thing he noticed. Or rather, it had the rusted ghost of a broken iron latch hanging from the frame by a single bent nail. The wood was swollen with winter warped at the bottom, where it dragged against the stone, and someone had stuffed a strip of old burlap into the gap along the side to keep the wind out. It hadn't worked. The wind came through anyway. He could hear voices inside. Low ones. The careful kind people use when they are trying not to wake something fragile. The cough again, closer now. And beneath it, the sound of a small fire struggling to stay alive, the weak pop and hiss of wet wood that hadn't quite caught. He raised his fist and knocked. Silence. Not the silence of an empty house. The silence of people who had learned to go very still when a knock came in the dark. "I'm not here to cause harm," he said through the wood. A long pause. Then the scrape of a stool. Then her voice low and level from just on the other side of the door. "You followed me?" "Yes." Another pause. "Why?" He considered the question honestly. "I don't know yet." He heard her exhale. A short, sharp sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a curse, and lived somewhere in the narrow country between them. Then the door opened. The inside of the house was one room. I took it in all at once. The single straw pallet against the far wall. The small stone hearth, where a fire was indeed barely surviving, 2 damp lengths of wood, propped over a fistful of orange coals that were doing their best and losing. A rough table. 2 stools. A shelf with almost nothing on it. A clay cup, a small bundle of dried herbs, a candle burned nearly to its base. And on the pallet, wrapped in what looked like every scrap of fabric the house owned. A moth-eaten wool blanket, a man's old coat, something that might once have been a curtain. A child, a boy. 6 years old, perhaps. With Marin's dark eyes and a fever that had painted his cheeks a deep, unnatural rose. He was awake. Watching Torvald from the pallet with the particular wariness of a child who has already learned that strangers at the door in the dark rarely bring anything good. His small chest rose and fell with the labor of it, and every few seconds the cough came wet and rattling, and far too big for the body it lived in. Torvald stood in the doorway. Then he looked at Marin. She had placed herself between him and the boy. Not dramatically, not with her arms flung wide. Just standing there, her body set with absolute precision in the space between the door and the pallet. A wall of one. Her chin lifted the same way it had been on the path when she'd held out the bread. That composure again held so tightly, it almost passed for coldness, until you noticed how hard her fingers were curled at her sides. "His name is Cassian," she said. "He's my brother. He's had the fever 4 days." Torvald said nothing. "I've given him everything I have," she went on, and her voice stayed level, the words laid down one at a time like stones across a stream. No invitation to pity, just the facts of the thing. "The Hold's physician lives at the north end of the village. I went to him 2 days ago." She paused. "He told me he doesn't treat servants' families. He told me to come back when I had coin." The fire popped. Cassian coughed. "The bread was for him," Torvald said. Not a question. "Bread is easier to eat when your throat hurts," she said simply. "And he hasn't kept much down." Torvald looked at the boy. Cassian had not looked away from him once. There was no welcome in that small, dark gaze. Only the watchfulness of someone very young who has already somehow understood that the world does not hand out kindness for free. And something moved in Torvald's chest that he could not immediately name. He turned back toward the door. "I'll send the physician tonight." Her composure broke, not into relief, into something more complicated. A tightening around her eyes. A slight parting of her lips as though the words had landed somewhere unexpected and tender, and she had not braced for it. "He won't come," she said. "Not for us." "He will come," Torvald said, "when I send him." A silence. "Why?" she asked. It was the same question he'd asked her on the path. He recognized it, and almost gave her the same answer, "I don't know yet," because it would have been honest. Instead, he said, "Because the boy needs a physician." He glanced once at Cassian. "And because your physician apparently needs reminding what his purpose is." He stepped back from the doorway. The cold folded around him at once. "Stay with your brother. Someone will come before the hour is out." And then, because the strange evening seemed determined to keep being strange, he paused. His eyes went for just a moment to the shelf, to a single carved wooden bird sitting beside the clay cup no bigger than a thumb, worn smooth with handling. He knew that carving. Not that one, but its cousin, its kin. The particular curve of the wing, the way the tail flared. He had seen that hand before, that style. A very long time ago in a valley settlement a full day's ride to the west, but he said nothing. He only turned and walked out into the dark. Maren stood in the open doorway and watched him go. She watched until the darkness swallowed him whole, until there was nothing left of him but the sound of his boots on the frozen ground. And then, not even that, Cassian coughed behind her. She closed the door gently so the broken latch caught and went back to kneel beside the pallet. She pressed her palm to her brother's forehead. Still burning. She dipped the rag in the clay cup, wrung it out, laid it across his brow. "Who was that man?" Cassian asked. His voice was hoarse and small. "Someone from the hold." "Is he going to hurt us?" She smoothed his hair back. "No." And then, because Cassian was watching her with those eyes that had always seen straight through everything she tried to protect him from, she added the truer thing. "I don't think so." "You don't sound sure." "I'm not," she admitted. "Go to sleep." He closed his eyes. She sat beside him on the cold stone floor, her back against the wall, the thin warmth of the failing fire reaching her in small, insufficient waves. She pulled the old coat higher over his shoulders and watched the coals and thought about the bread, about the way Torvald had looked at it in her open hands, and then looked at her, not through her, not the way the men of the hold looked at her as though she were part of the masonry, but at her, with a focused attention that had felt almost like a hand pressed flat against her sternum, like he was reading something written there in a language she hadn't known she was wearing. "Keep it," he had said. She had not expected that. She had expected anger, or the cold mechanical machinery of punishment, docked wages, dismissal, the stocks if the mood took him. She had prepared for every one of those things on the walk down the hill, laying them out in her mind, like tools on a bench deciding which she could survive. She had not prepared for keep it. And she found now, sitting in the dark, with her brother's fever burning under her palm, that unprepared was a more dangerous state than any of the others. Dangerous because it left room for a thing she could not afford. Across the village, the door of the physician's house opened to a sharp knock, and a young man in the silver livery of Corveth Hold, who delivered a message in 4 flat sentences and waited unsmiling while the color drained out of the physician's face. Merrick was not underneath it all a wicked man. I was only a comfortable one, which is a different failing and sometimes a worse one. He'd grown accustomed to the pleasant arrangement in which his services flowed upward toward those who could reward him, and never down toward those who could only need him. And he had told himself in the vague way men tell themselves such things, that this was simply how the world was built, and not a thing he had personally chosen. He arrived at Maren's door with his bag in hand, less than 20 minutes later. He did not meet her eyes. He simply said, "I'm here for the boy," and stepped inside. He worked over Cassian for the better part of an hour, and when at last he straightened, wiping his hands, he told her. The fever would break by morning if she followed his instructions, and he left medicines on the table. Small stoppered bottles that must have cost more than she earned in a season, and a great deal of visible discomfort in the air behind him. At the door he paused. He did not look at her. He looked at the wall at a spot just past her shoulder, and he spoke quietly as though the words were being pulled out of him against the grain. "The first time you came to me," he said, "with the boy, 2 days ago." Maren went still. "I want you to know I was told not to treat you." His jaw worked. "Before you ever knocked. There was an instruction that servants' families were not to be seen without coin in advance." He finally looked at her, and there was something almost pleading in it. The look of a man asking to be believed about the one part of the thing that might make him less guilty. "It was not my rule. It was passed to me." "Passed to you," Maren said. "By whom?" But he only shook his head, once, and picked up his bag. "Follow the instructions," he said. "He'll mend." And he was gone out into the cold, his lantern swinging, leaving Maren standing in the doorway with a new and unwelcome question sitting in her chest like a stone dropped into a well she hadn't known was there. By whom? Because someone had reached down before she ever climbed that hill, before Cassian ever coughed his first wet cough and made a small, quiet decision that a servant's dying brother was not worth the trouble. Someone with the authority to instruct a physician. Someone who had apparently been watching her long before the Alpha King ever stood at his window with an untouched cup of wine. She looked back at Cassian, sleeping now, his breath already a little easier under the medicine's mercy. Then she looked out the open door, up the black shoulder of the hill, to where the hold sat against the gray sky, with its torches burning along its walls. Solid, immense, a thing built to remind you from down here of your place. It had always looked like a threat. Tonight it looked like something else, and she couldn't have said what. 3 floors above the village, Torvald stood at his window with a cup of wine he had once again entirely forgotten to drink. He had told himself he'd only stopped at the glass for a moment. That had been some time ago now. Below him, in the dark cluster of houses, a single lantern moved along the row, the physician making his way home, the work done that should have been done days ago and never was. And somewhere down there in the dark was a woman who had stood in a freezing doorway with stolen bread in her open hands, her chin up, and had not offered him one word of apology. Not one. Who had built him a lie so plain he could see the seams in it, and had held that lie with more dignity than most men held their truths. The bread was for him. He hasn't kept much down. And there had been the carving, the little wooden bird on her shelf. I was almost certain of it, now turning it over in his memory, the way he'd wanted to turn it over in his hand. That style belonged to a particular valley to the west. A settlement called Fenwick, half a day's hard ride, most of it gone quiet, now emptied by bad harvests and worse winters. He had passed through it once as a boy of 15 on the long road south with his father half frozen and separated from the party in a squall. And a woman there had taken him in, just for an afternoon, until the weather cleared and his father's men found him. A woman in a small house with careful hands and a warm hearth, who had given a lost, shivering, frightened boy a cup of broth and a heel of bread, and had not once asked who he was, or what his father might pay for the kindness. She had simply fed him, because he was cold, and small, and there. She had a baby, he remembered, newborn or near it, asleep in a basket by the fire, and on the mantel above that fire a row of small carved birds. He set the cup down. He did not for certain. He could not have sworn to it. A carving style was not a name, and a valley was not a bloodline, and a man of his position could not go rearranging the world around a wooden bird, and a hunch, and the color of a woman's eyes. But he knew this much, that somewhere in his chest, in the exact spot where her steady gaze had pressed, an old debt had turned over in its sleep and begun quietly to wake. And something else had woken with it. Smaller, more dangerous. The precise, stubborn dignity of a woman standing in a doorway with nothing left to give, and giving it anyway. It had lodged somewhere behind his ribs, and it was refusing with great determination to leave. He looked down at the dark houses a while longer. This, he thought, was a complication he had not anticipated when he'd risen that morning. He had a keep to run, a council that argued, a border in dispute, a physician who apparently took his instructions from someone other than his king, which was now that he considered it a thread worth pulling, by whom he thought, though he did not yet know the woman below, was thinking the very same two words at the very same moment. He would find out, for now the boy would live, and the woman with the steady eyes and the cracked boot and the little carved bird would wake tomorrow to a brother whose fever had broken, and would not know that 3 floors above her, a king was standing awake in the dark, turning over a 15-year-old kindness and a warm loaf of bread, and wondering for the first time in longer than he could remember whether being obeyed and being known were the same thing. They were not. He was beginning to suspect they had never been. Below, the last lantern reached the last house and went dark. The snow, which had been threatening all night, finally began to fall. Slow, soft, settling over the hold and the hill and the village and the small house at the end of the row, with its broken latch and its dark chimney, where a fire was at last beginning to catch. The east wing was quieter than the rest of the hold. That was why Marin preferred it. The great hall, the council chamber, the main corridors, those spaces were full of movement and noise, and the particular attention that powerful people pay to things they consider beneath them, which wears on a person in a way that has no name. But the east wing, with its long stone corridor and its high narrow windows that let in pale strips of morning, was usually empty at this hour. Just her, the mop, the cold floor, the sound of her own breathing. She worked the way she did everything, methodically. Far end, first working, back toward the door, the mop moving in long, even strokes. The stone was old and dark, the kind of gray that never quite looked clean, no matter how you scrubbed it. She scrubbed it anyway. It was the 3rd morning since Cassian's fever had broken. The physician had come back twice more. Uninvited both times, she'd noted, which meant someone was still sending him. And each time, Cassian had been a little more himself, a little more the boy who argued about everything and asked questions with no bottom to them. She had not spoken to Torvald since the night on the path. She had seen him twice, once crossing the inner yard with 2 of his advisors, once at the far end of the great hall during the evening meal that servants carried and never ate. Both times he had not looked in her direction, or if he had, she hadn't caught it. She told herself this was the natural order restored. A moment of unexpected mercy, not a relationship. A physician sent in the dark was not a promise. The Alpha King of Corveth had 1,000 concerns larger than a maid with a sick brother, and she would do well to remember it. She was telling herself this for roughly the 4th time that morning when she heard his footsteps. She knew them now. She hated that she knew them. Torvald had not planned to walk through the east wing. His morning had a shape. Council at the 7th hour. Then the North Gate, where a section of wall needed assessment. Then a letter to be dictated to the Ironhold Pack about a disputed stretch of grazing land. He knew the shape of his mornings with great precision, because precision was the thing that kept everything upright. A keep this size. A territory this wide. An authority held not through cruelty, but through consistency. The East Wing was not in the shape of his morning, and yet, here he was, walking down its long corridor at exactly the hour he knew it was cleaned, his hands clasped behind his back, his steps slowing as he came upon the sound of a mop on stone. He rounded the corner, and she was there, back to him, working. She wore the same gray dress she always wore, her hair pinned up tight. But the thin shawl was gone, he noticed, replaced by a heavier one. Dark green wool, still plain, still modest, but meaningfully warmer than the fraying thing she'd worn on the path. He had asked his housekeeper to leave it among the East Wing supplies 3 days ago. He had told himself it was practical. Cold servants worked less efficiently. That was all it was. She hadn't thanked him for it, because she didn't know it was from him. She thought, presumably, that someone had simply left it the way small mercies sometimes just appear. He watched her work for a moment. Then she went still. She didn't turn, but her hand stopped on the mop handle, and he knew she'd sensed him there. Whatever combination of sound and instinct told her. He'd noticed that about her. She was always aware of a room without appearing to be. A thing you learn only by spending years needing to know where the danger is before it reaches you. "The boy," he said. "Cassian. He's recovering." A brief pause. "Yes." She turned then just enough to look at him over her shoulder. "The physician says another week of rest and the medicines, and he'll be well." "Good." She turned back to the floor, and Torvald stood in the corridor, aware that he was standing in a corridor watching a maid mop, which was not a thing the Alpha King of Corveth was supposed to be doing with his morning, and finding that his feet had no particular opinion about moving. "You should have come to me," he said, "when the physician refused you. There are channels for—" "Channels," she repeated the word, and something in the way she said it, so dry and flat and exact, stopped him mid-sentence. She turned fully now, looked at him with those steady eyes. "My lord, I've worked in this hold for 6 years. I know what the channels are." A pause. "The channels are for people who exist in this hold, not for people who clean its floors." "You exist in this hold," he said. "I function in this hold," she corrected, quietly. "Those aren't the same thing." The words landed with a plainness that made them harder to dismiss than any accusation could have been. She wasn't angry. She wasn't performing. She was simply stating a truth she had lived with long enough that it no longer surprised her. Torvald found he had nothing to say to that, which was itself a novelty. He had answers for most things. It was part of the job. He stood there a moment longer than was reasonable. Then, because he had come with a question, and not only a whim, he asked it. "When you went to the physician," he said, "that first time, he told you no." "He did." "Did he tell you it was his own decision?" Maren went still again, but a different kind of still, the kind that listens. "He told me," she said slowly, "that he doesn't treat servants' families." Then, watching his face, "But 2 nights ago when he came, he told me something else. He said he'd been instructed, before I ever knocked, told not to see us without coin in advance." Torvald's expression did not change, but something behind it did. "Instructed by whom?" he said. He wouldn't say. She held his gaze. "I was hoping you might know." And there it was, laid down between them like a card turned face up. Because she had understood the same as he had, that a physician does not take orders from the air. That someone in this hold, someone with the standing to instruct, had reached down before any of this began, and decided her brother's life was not worth the interruption. Torvald looked at her for a long moment. "I'll find out," he said, and he meant it. She could hear that he meant it the way she'd learned to hear the true weight in a sentence versus the polite hollow of one. He turned to go, then stopped. "Fenwick," he said. "Just the word." Marin's hands tightened on the mop. "The carving on your shelf," he went on, not looking at her, now looking instead at the pale window at the corridor's end. "The little bird, that's Fenwick work, the valley settlement to the west." "It was my mother's," Marin said, carefully. "She carved." "I thought so." He didn't explain. He simply nodded once to himself, as though a small stone had been set into place in some structure only he could see. And then he walked on down the corridor and left her standing there with the mop and the cold floor, and a question that had just grown a second stranger head. How does the Alpha King of Corveth know my mother's work by sight? From the far end of the corridor, half hidden in the shadow of the stairwell, a man watched the whole exchange with narrow eyes. His name was Rutherford Vane, though most in the hold called him Ruel, the way you shorten the name of a thing you've stopped being afraid of. He was the keep's steward. A lean, well-dressed man of perhaps 50 silver at his temples, a smile that arrived a half-second before it was felt. He had managed the practical affairs of Corveth Hold for 11 years through 2 administrations, and he had survived both by understanding one thing above all others: which way power moves, and how to stand in its path. He had been on his way to the council chamber when he'd seen Torvald turn down the east wing. Curiosity had made him follow quietly the way he did most things, and now he stood watching his king hold a conversation with a floor mopper about the nature of existing versus functioning, and about a valley called Fenwick, and about a physician's instructions. Instructions. Ruel's pleasant expression did not so much as flicker, but inside something cold and careful, sat up and paid attention. Because he was the one who had instructed Merrick. A small thing, months ago, a tidy economy servant's families were a drain, and the physician's time was better spent upward. He had not thought of it since. It had been beneath thinking of. And now the king was pulling on that thread. In an east wing corridor, beside a girl. This was new. Ruel was a man who noticed new things, and filed them the way a merchant files an unusual coin. Not because he knows its value yet, but because a day may come when he does. He watched a moment longer, the way the king stood when he spoke to her, not the posture of a lord addressing a servant, but something more level than that, more attentive. He watched the girl hold herself straight-backed and unafraid. Then he stepped back into the stairwell and went up to the council chamber by a different route, his face pleasant and unreadable, his mind already moving 3 steps ahead. The carriage arrived in the night. Marin saw it the next morning, crossing the outer yard, a fine thing of black lacquer and brass. 2 attendants unloading trunks and standing beside it, a woman she had never seen before, tall, fair-haired, dressed in traveling clothes of deep burgundy wool that had never once been mended. Perhaps 35. Elegant and sharp-featured, with the particular bearing of someone who had grown up being looked at and had decided long ago that this was only fair. "You're the maid," the woman said. Marin stopped. "The one from the east wing." The woman's eyes moved over her calm, assessing the way you might appraise a horse you had no intention of buying. And now the West Wing, I'm told. Because Marin had been moved. 2 days prior. Reassigned to the upper corridor, the residential level. The king's own floor by a housekeeper named Gudrun, who explained nothing and answered nothing, and told her only, 5th hour, don't be late. I work in the hold, Marin said. Yes, the woman smiled. A precise practiced thing that conveyed warmth without containing any. Lady Ottilie, she said, I've come to visit the king. A pause, small and beautifully timed. We have a great deal to discuss. And she walked past Marin into the hold. Ruel followed a step behind her, and as he passed, he caught Marin's eye just for a moment, and there was nothing pleasant in it at all. Only a flat, attentive assessment gone before she could be sure she'd seen it. Marin stood in the cold yard with her bucket, the wind moving through her green wool shawl, and understood with a clarity that arrived all at once that the shape of things had shifted in some way she had not been prepared for. She picked up the bucket and went to work. Lady Ottilie moved through Corveth Hold like she already held the deed to it. Marin observed this from the edges. From the doorway, the corridor, the invisibility that 6 years had sharpened into an art. Ottilie walked with her chin at an angle that suggested every room had been arranged in advance for her benefit. She spoke to the staff in the pleasant clipped tones of a woman who addressed servants as a courtesy rather than a necessity. She laughed at the right moments during meals. She wore different clothes for morning and evening, each set, flawless, each color chosen, with the instinct of someone who understood that appearance is a kind of argument you can win before you speak. She was by every visible measure exactly what a king's consort was supposed to look like. And Ruel was at her side for nearly every public moment, which told Marin everything she needed to know about whose idea this visit had been. Torvald was civil, attentive in the way duty required. He sat across from Ottilie at the evening meal and answered her questions about the Northern Territories with the focused patience of a man doing the work he was born to do. Marin, carrying a water pitcher along the side of the hall, watched his face during one of these exchanges. Not the face he showed Ottilie. The other one. The one in the half-second before he arranged it, when he thought no one was looking. It was the face of a man doing something that felt correct and hollow at the very same time. She looked away before he could catch her watching, and she told herself, walking home that night through the snow, that it meant nothing to her. That the marriages of kings were not her business. That she was a maid with a brother to raise and a fire to keep, and a fine burgundy-clad lady in the great hall was simply the world resuming its natural arrangement. She told herself this all the way down the hill. She did not entirely believe it, which frightened her more than anything Ottilie could have said. On the 3rd day of Ottilie's visit, the trouble came. It came the way real trouble usually does. Not with a shout, with a knock. Marin was on the residential floor polishing the iron sconces when Gudrun appeared at the end of the corridor with 2 guards behind her and an expression like a door being closed. "You're to come," the housekeeper said. "Now." They took her to a small stone room off the steward's office. And there, on a plain table, laid out on a square of dark cloth, as though it were evidence at a trial which she would shortly understand, it was sat a silver brooch. Lady Ottilie's brooch. A heron worked in silver and pale blue stone. Marin had seen it pinned at the woman's throat 2 nights running. This was found, Ruel said from the corner where he stood with his hands folded, beneath the mattress in the servants' dormitory. Where your belongings are kept during your shifts. Marin's mouth went dry, because she did keep a small bundle there. a spare apron, a comb, her mother's second carved bird, the smaller one, the one she couldn't bear to leave in a house with a broken latch. And someone had reached into that bundle, into the one private handful of things she owned in all this vast stone place, and left a lady's brooch inside it. "I didn't take that," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that, distantly, the way you notice one small, competent thing while the floor gives way beneath you. "No one is saying you did," Ruel said, pleasantly, which was worse than an accusation. "We are only saying it was found, and that given the pattern, the bread from the kitchens, and now this certain conclusions arrange themselves. The bread." He knew about the bread, which meant he had been watching that night too, or had learned of it after, which meant, "The king knows about the bread," Marin said slowly. He forgave it. "The king," Ruel said, and here his smile arrived a full second before it was felt, "is a busy man with a great many matters before him, and a visitor of considerable importance whose brooch has gone missing under a servant's mattress. I'm sure you understand how it looks." She understood exactly how it looked. She understood it had been built to look precisely that way. They sent for the king, because a theft from a noble guest was not a matter a steward could resolve alone, and Ruel knew it, and Ruel had counted on it. This was the part of the trap that mattered, not the brooch. The brooch was only the jaws. The teeth were this the king made to stand in front of his council and his guest, and choose in public between a maid he had shown a strange mercy to, and the good order of his own hold. Torvald came. He stood in the doorway of the small stone room and looked at the brooch on its square of cloth, then at Ruel, then at Marin, who stood very straight with her chin up and her hands curled at her sides. "She says she didn't take it," Ruel offered. Mild, helpful. "But it was found in her belongings. Lady Ottilie is understandably distressed, and the council, my lord, will wish to see the matter handled cleanly. For the sake of the guest, for the sake of the arrangement. The word hung in the cold air. And Torvald looked at Marin, and Marin looked back at him, and she saw the exact moment it happened. The moment the machinery of his position closed around him. The council, the alliance, the lady in Burgundy, the 11 years of consistency that held his whole world upright, and a maid with a brooch under her mattress and no proof but her own steady eyes. He hesitated. It was not long. A breath, perhaps two. To anyone else in the room, it would have looked like nothing at all, like a king weighing a matter, which is what a king is meant to do. But Marin saw it. She saw him hesitate. And something in her chest, some small, warm, foolish thing that had been growing since a night on an icy path. When a powerful man said keep it, went quietly and completely cold, because she had let herself believe. That was the mistake. Not the bread, not the brooch, the believing. She had allowed one act of mercy, and one green wool shawl, and one conversation about existing versus functioning, to teach her against 6 years of hard-won sense that she might be a person here, and not a variable. And here was the answer. Here was the exact market price of a maid's word against a lady's brooch measured out in one man's hesitation. "Take her belongings and examine them," Torvald said finally, "and confine her apart until this is understood. No harm to her. No harm, do you hear me? But she stays where I can find her." It was, in fact, mercy. Again. He was buying time, not condemning her, holding the thing open instead of letting it snap shut. But Marin did not hear mercy. Marin heard confine her. Marin heard the hesitation that had come before it. Marin heard the sound of a door she had briefly foolishly believed was open, swinging quietly closed. She said nothing. She let them lead her away. And she did not look at him as she went, which was its own kind of message, and he received it, and it sat in him like a swallowed stone for the rest of that long night. They put her in a cold room in the lower wing. A cot, a high-barred window, a door with a real lock unlike the one on her house. But Cassian was at home. Cassian was 6 years old, and alone in a house at the edge of a village with a broken latch and a fire. He was not allowed to build himself, waiting for a sister who was not coming home. And that thought was the one that finally broke her composure alone in the dark, where no one could see. It cost her anything. Not the brooch, not the hesitation, not even the closing door. Cassian, alone, waiting. She sat on the cold cot, with her back against the cold wall, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself be afraid all the way down. Ruel had made only one error. He had not counted on the boy, because Cassian. That same evening, when the guards came to turn the family's small belongings inside out when strangers filled his one warm room and spoke over his head about his sister, as though she were a problem in a ledger, had done the thing he always did when the world grew too large and too frightening to hold. He had watched, and he had drawn. He drew everything. He had been drawing since before he could speak in whole sentences the towers of the hold, the shape of a horse, the exact fall of light through the one window. He remembered with his hands what other people forgot with their heads. And the night before, on the evening the brooch was hidden, Cassian had been in the servants' yard. I was not supposed to have been. Marin had told him with great clarity that the hold was her place of work, and not a place for small boys to wander. And Cassian had agreed with the cooperative expression he used when he had already decided to do the opposite. He had wanted to see the towers properly up close to get the proportions right. And from the shadow of the dormitory doorway, unseen, a small boy with a piece of charcoal and a flat scrap of wood had watched a well-dressed man with silver at his temples slip inside alone and kneel by a particular bundle and tuck something small and bright beneath it, and rise and glance once over his shoulder and go. Cassian had not known what it meant, not known, but he had drawn it. The way he drew everything. The man, the bundle, the bright small thing in his hand. The exact tilt of that backward glance. And now Cassian sat alone in a cold house at the edge of the village, holding a scrap of wood with a picture on it, and understood with the clean, terrible logic of a child, two things at once: that the man in his drawing was the reason his sister was gone, and that the drawing was the only thing in the world that could bring her back. He was 6. But he was Marin's brother, which meant he had learned at that same cold hearth the same hard lesson she had, that when the world will not help you, you stop waiting for it to. You put on your coat, the old one, the too big one that had been their father's. You take the thing that matters, and you hold it against your chest with both arms, and you climb the hill in the dark, toward the only person in that whole vast stone place who had ever crouched down to your level, taken a drawing from your hand, and told you seriously, as though your ideas had weight, that the North Tower had needed rebuilding for 15 years, and Corveth might one day need your services. Cassian did not go to find the king. Cassian went to find the physician, because the physician was the one who came to the house. The physician was the one Cassian heard muttering to himself while he thought the boy was asleep. The king's instructions are clear. The king's instructions are clear 3 times over, which meant the physician had a way to reach the king that a locked-out 6-year-old did not. Merrick opened his door near midnight to a small, dark shape in an enormous coat, snow in his hair, a scrap of wood clutched to his chest, breathing hard from the climb. "They took Marin," Cassian said, "before the door was fully open. And I know who did it. I saw. I drew it. You have to give it to the king." And he held the wood up, both hands, flat-palmed, chin lifted, the exact way his sister had once held out a warm loaf of bread on an icy path. Merrick looked down at the drawing in the boy's hands, at the well-dressed figure kneeling by a bundle, at the silver detail, carefully, at the temples with the side of a child's charcoal, at the bright, small thing being tucked out of sight. And the comfortable man felt the comfort drain out of him, because he knew that figure. Everyone in the hold knew that figure. "Come in out of the cold," Merrick said quietly. "Come in, boy, and bring your drawing." While all of this moved in the dark below, another door was opening in the hold above. Lady Ottilie had not slept. She sat in the fine guest chambers Ruel had arranged for her, and she turned the evening over in her clever, sharp-featured mind, and she did not like the shape of it, because Ottilie was many things. Proud, ambitious, raised to see marriage as a map of territory and advantage. But she was not stupid, and she was not when it came down to the marrow of her cruel. And she had watched a maid stand in a stone room with her chin up and her eyes steady, and say, "I didn't take that," in a voice with no lie in it. Ottilie had spent her whole life in rooms full of liars. She knew the sound of the truth when it was rare enough to be startling. And she had watched Ruel. Ruel who had steered her here. Ruel who arranged the meals and the seating and the conversations. Ruel whose brooch it had so conveniently been found, so conveniently, at so convenient a moment for the arrangement he was so very invested in. My brooch, she thought, because that was the part that would not sit still. It was her brooch, and she had not reported it missing. She had not even known it was missing. She had last seen it 2 evenings ago, and she had not worn it since, and she had certainly not gone looking for it. Which meant that someone had known it was gone before she did. Which meant someone had taken it from her rooms to plant it in the Maid's. And there was only one person who moved through this hold, as though every door were already open to him. Ottilie rose. She went to the window. Below, in the black yard, snow was falling on the towers, and somewhere down the hill, a single lantern was climbing toward a physician's door, though she could not have known that. She thought her father. About the arrangement. About the 2 years of careful discussions that had brought her here in a black lacquer carriage to marry a king who looked across a dinner table like a man doing something correct and hollow at the same time. And she thought about a thing she had told no one. A thing Ruel held over her father, like a blade held loosely at a throat. A private matter of the Vane family. A debt, a secret, a leverage, the reason her father had signed, where he'd signed, and sent his daughter where he'd sent her. Ruel had built this, all of it, her included. She was not a bride. She was a brooch, planted where she'd be found. And Lady Ottilie, who was proud and ambitious and raised on maps of advantage, discovered in herself at that cold midnight window. One thing she had not known was there. A limit, a place past which she would not be moved, not for a crown, not for a territory, not for all the careful discussions in the world. She turned from the window. She reached for her traveling cloak. And somewhere below her in the dark, a child climbed toward a physician's door with a drawing held to his chest, and a maid sat awake in a locked room with her back to a cold wall, and a king lay sleepless with a swallowed stone behind his ribs, and a 15-year-old kindness turning over and over in his mind. 4 people, awake in the same dark, each holding one corner of the same buried truth, and the snow kept falling on the hold, soft and patient and total, the way it does when a long winter is finally about to break. The physician reached the king's study before dawn. He had not slept. He had a small boy asleep in a chair by his fire, wrapped in the too big coat, one charcoal-stained hand still curled around the scrap of wood even in sleep. And he had a decision that had kept him awake since midnight, turning it the way you turn a coin you already know the weight of, because Merrick was a coward. He knew this about himself the way you know an old ache. He had spent his life letting his services flow upward and never down, and he had told himself it was simply how the world was built. Except a child had climbed a hill in the dark and held a drawing out to him with both hands and a lifted chin, and something in the shape of that had made the world he'd built feel suddenly very small and very cold. So he went. He stood in the king's study in the gray hour before the sun, and he laid the boy's drawing on the desk, and he said the thing he should have said months ago. There was an instruction, Merrick said, about the servants' families. That first refusal. It didn't come from me, my lord. It came from your steward. Torvald looked at the drawing, the kneeling figure, the silver at the temples detailed with the side of a child's charcoal. The bundle, the bright small thing being tucked out of sight, the exact tilt of the backward glance. He looked at it for a long time, and the swallowed stone behind his ribs, the one that had sat there, since he'd watched a maid be led away, the one that had been made of his own hesitation, turned slowly into something else. Something with an edge. Where did the boy get this? Torvald said, very quietly. He drew it, the night before you took her. From the dormitory doorway. Merrick swallowed. My lord, that boy remembers with his hands what other men forget with their heads. He didn't know what he was drawing. He only drew what he saw. What he saw. Ruel, alone, kneeling by a servant's bundle, hiding a brooch that a lady had not yet even reported missing, because you cannot report a thing missing that you do not know is gone, which meant someone had taken it before she knew, which meant the theft ran the other direction entirely up, not down, and the maid with the steady eyes had been standing in that stone room, telling the plain truth the whole time. And he had hesitated. He had stood in front of his counsel and his guest, and for one breath, too, he had let the machinery of his position weigh a maid's word against a lady's brooch, and he had not in that moment chosen her. He would carry that. He knew it already. Some hesitations you don't get to set down, but he could choose now. Wake the boy when he needs waking, Torvald said. Feed him. Keep him warm. He was already moving, already reaching for his cloak. And Merrick. My lord, you climbed a hill too, eventually. A pause. It's not nothing. Remember that the next time it's easier to stay by your own fire. He went to find her first. Not Ruel. Her. Because the order of things mattered, and the thing that had to come before justice, before any of it, was standing in a cold, locked room in front of a woman he had failed and saying so. He unlocked the door himself. Maren was awake. Of course she was awake. She sat on the cot with her back against the wall and her chin up, and when the door opened and she saw who it was, She did not stand, and she did not soften, and she did not give him the mercy of pretending the last night hadn't happened. She simply looked at him, steady, the way she'd looked at him on the path, the way she'd looked at him over a loaf of bread held out in both hands. Except now there was a wall behind the steadiness that had not been there before, and he had built that wall. In one breath. 2. "You didn't take it," Torvald said. "I know," she said. "I've known the whole time. It was the rest of you who needed convincing." The words landed exactly where she'd aimed them. "You hesitated," she said. Not a question, not an accusation even. Just a stone laid flat on the table between them. In that room. You looked at me and you weighed it, and for a moment I wasn't a person to you. I was a variable, the same as I am to your steward, the same as I've been to this whole hold for 6 years. Torvald did not flinch from it. That was the one thing she would give him later when she'd had time to sort it all. That he did not flinch, and he did not explain, and he did not reach for a single one of the 1,000 reasons a king has ready for why he did the thing he did. "Yes," he said, "I did. Just that. I hesitated. And a woman who had never lied to me except to protect her brother stood in front of me, telling the truth, and I made her wait for me to see it. That is mine. I won't hand it back to you dressed up as something smaller." Maren said nothing, because she had prepared in the long, cold hours for excuses, for a king's justifications, for the polished machinery of a powerful man explaining why his failure was really a strategy. She had not prepared for yes, and unprepared, she was learning again, was the most dangerous state of all. "Your brother is safe," Torvald said. "He's with the physician, warm-fed sleeping." He paused. He climbed the hill in the dark Maren, with a drawing. He saw who hid the brooch from a doorway, and he drew it, and he carried it up to a physician's door, because he understood it was the only thing that could bring you back. Maren's composure, which had held through the brooch and the stone room and the closing door and the long, cold night, finally cracked. Not into relief, into something more complicated. Cassian, alone, in the dark, climbing the hill. "He's 6, she said, and her voice broke on the number. "He's yours," Torvald said. "It shows." He held the door open. "Come out of this room. There's a reckoning to be had, and I'd like you standing beside me, for it not behind a lock. But that's your choice. It's the first thing in a long while that's going to be entirely your choice, and I won't take it from you." Maren looked at the open door. Then she stood. Not for him. She wanted that understood in the private court of her own chest. She stood for Cassian, who had climbed a hill. And she stood for herself for the 6 years of careful smallness, because there was a man with silver at his temples who had decided her life and her brother's life were variables to be corrected, and she intended to be standing upright when he learned he'd been wrong. She walked out of the room, chin up, the way she did everything. But when they reached the top of the stairs, a guard was waiting. White-faced, breathless. "My lord," he said. "The steward, he's gone. Cleared his office in the night papers, burned in the grate, still smoking. And," the man's throat worked, the boy, my lord, the physician's boy. Vane took him, on his way out. There's a servant saw him carry a child toward the North Tower not a quarter-hour past." The world tilted, because Merrick had a small boy asleep in a chair by his fire. And Merrick had come to the study before dawn to lay a drawing on a desk. And in the time it took one coward to find his courage, The steward had learned the ground was moving beneath him and had reached the way cornered men reach for the nearest thing that could still be turned into leverage. A 6-year-old with a drawing, the only witness who had actually seen his hands. "The North Tower," Marin said, and every drop of color left her face. Not because of the cold, because of the tower itself. The one that had needed rebuilding for 15 years. The one with the cracked stairs and the rotted floors, and the great open drop where the west wall had fallen away and never been mended. The one Cassian drew every single day from his window because he loved it. Because it was the most dangerous place in all of Corveth to hold a child. And Ruel had chosen it precisely because Cassian loved it. Because a man like Ruel understood that the fastest way to break someone is through the thing they cherish. Marin did not wait for the king. She ran. The North Tower rose against the dawn like a broken tooth. Snow had drifted through the shattered west wall and lay in pale sheets across the floor, and the wind came up the open stairwell and moaned through the gaps in the stone. And there, near the ragged edge where the wall had fallen away, where the drop opened onto the frozen yard 4 floors below, stood Ruel. One hand gripping the collar of a small boy's too big coat. Cassian was not crying. That was the thing that struck Marin first from the top of the stairs, her breath tearing her whole body one raised alarm. Cassian was not crying. He was watching the man's hands the way he watched everything, cataloging, even now, even here, because that was the thing he did instead of falling apart. "Stop there," Ruel said. His pleasant smile was gone. What was left was the face beneath it, the one he'd worn for 11 years without letting anyone see. Cold. Exact. A man who had built his whole self on standing in the path of power and had just felt the ground open where he'd been standing. "The drawing," he said to Torvald, who had come up the stairs behind Marin, who had stopped, who understood at once that this was not a place for a king's authority to be swung like a hammer. "The boy. Both go, and you let me leave Corveth by the eastern road. Or—" He didn't finish it. He shifted his grip toward the edge instead, and let the drop finish the sentence for him. Marin's heart stopped. Torvald went very still, the stillness of deep water. She could feel him beside her, the tremendous held force of him, a man who could break most things in this hold with his hands, and could not in this one moment use any of it, because there was a child at the edge of a 4-story drop, and force here was the one thing that would kill him. "Ruel," Torvald said, low, level, "you don't want this." "You have no idea what I want." "No," Torvald agreed. "I never did. 11 years and I let you tell me what I wanted instead. That's mine to carry. But that boy is 6 years old, and whatever you've built, whatever you're losing, he's not the ledger. It goes in." "Everyone's a ledger," Ruel said. And for one terrible second, Marin heard underneath the words, an exhaustion so old, it had become the man. "That's the only thing I ever understood that the rest of you pretend not to." And his hand tightened on the collar. Marin stepped forward. Slowly, both hands open, the way you approach something that might bolt, but she was not looking at Ruel. She had understood in one clean flash that Ruel was not the person in this room she could reach. She was looking at Cassian. "Cassian," she said, and her voice, God knew how, came out steady. The sister voice, the one she used on him in the dark when the fever climbed and the fire failed and the world was too large to hold. The one that had carried him across a whole valley when he was small enough to fit in a basket. "Cassian, look at me. Not at him, at me. The boy's eyes came to her. Do you remember, she said, walking slowly, so slowly, one open hand held out, what I told you about the tower? The very first thing about where it's strong. Because Cassian knew this tower. Cassian had drawn this tower 100 times. Cassian knew better than the steward gripping his collar, better than the king, better than anyone alive, exactly where the old stone still held, and exactly where it didn't. And the ragged edge, where Ruel stood, the lip of the great drop, was rotten. Cassian had drawn the crack in it 12 times. The way the floor sagged there. The way you did not put your weight on that stone. The strong part, Cassian said, small, but clear, is by the stairs, not the edge, never the edge. That's right, Marin said. So when I say, you come to the strong part, you come to me, as fast as you've ever run in your life. Ruel understood a half-second too late. He felt the stone shift under his own boot, the old rotten lip of it, the thing the boy had been telling them both without telling him. He looked down, and in that half-second, that one flinch of his attention toward his own feet, his grip loosened. No, Marin said. Cassian ran. I was 6, and he was small, and he was fast, and he knew every strong stone in that ruined floor the way you know the words to a song you were raised on. He ran the safe line, the one he'd traced with his eyes 100 times from a window down the hill, straight along the spine of the old stone, past the sagging floor into his sister's open arms. And Marin caught him. She caught him, and she turned her whole body between him and the edge, the wall of one, the exact stance she'd taken in a doorway on the night. This all began, and she did not look back to see what became of the man behind them. But Torvald did. Torvald moved the instant the boy was clear, not toward Ruel with violence, toward him with a hand, because the rotten stone had chosen its moment, and it went a slow, grinding surrender of old rock, and Ruel's arms went wide, and he was falling, or beginning to. And the king of Corveth, who had every reason in the world to let him go, reached out and caught the collar of the man who had tried to murder a child. He hauled him back from the edge. He threw him down onto the strong stone, gasping alive, and he stood over him breathing hard, and did not strike him. You wanted a reckoning, Torvald said. This is it. You live. You stand trial. You answer in daylight in front of everyone for what you've done to her, to the boy, to the families you decided weren't worth a physician's time. His voice dropped. I could throw you off this tower, and no man here would question it. That's what you'd do if our places were traded. I know that now. He crouched, so they were level. But I'm not going to, he said, because the difference between us was never power. You always had a version of it. The difference is what a person does when they finally have someone at the edge of a drop. He rose. You taught me that. Just not the way you meant to. The guards took Ruel down the stairs. He did not look back at the hold as they led him out, and Marin stood in the ruined tower with her brother wrapped tight in her arms, snow drifting through the broken wall. The dawn coming up gold and cold through the gap where the world had nearly ended, and she held Cassian, and she shook finally, now that it was safe to, and Cassian held her back and said into her shoulder very seriously, I told you the edge wasn't strong. And Marin, half a sob and half a laugh, the two of them tangled up the way they always were with her, said, You did tell me. You tell me everything. The trial was held in daylight in the great hall with everyone. That was Torvald's doing. He could have handled it quietly. Kings usually did. But he had learned something about the difference between handling a thing cleanly and handling it truly. And so the doors were opened, and the servants came, the ones who mopped the floors and hauled the water and carried the meals they never ate, and they stood along the walls and heard it all. They heard about the physician's instruction. They heard about the brooch taken from a lady's rooms before she knew it was gone. They heard about a boy's drawing, and they heard Lady Ottilie, because Ottilie had come to the study that same gray morning cloak on having reached her own limit at her own cold window. And she stood now in the great hall, in her burgundy wool, and told them all the rest of it. How Ruel had steered her here, how he'd held a private matter of her family over her father like a blade, how the whole arrangement had been his architecture brick by brick and she only one of the bricks. "I was raised to see people as territory," Ottilie said to the hall, her chin as high as Maurin's had ever been. "It's a hard thing to unlearn in a morning, but I found I could not stand in a room and watch a woman punished for a crime committed against her so that a man could tidy me into a marriage." She looked at Torvald. "You'd have been a decent match, I think. Correct and hollow, the both of us. I wish you better than correct." And she left Corveth that afternoon in her black lacquer carriage, freed of a blade at her family's throat, and pointed, though she didn't know it yet, toward a match 6 months off that would bring her a husband, both useful and genuinely entertaining, which she would come to consider a superior arrangement. Ruel was sentenced, provisions stripped, sent east under guard. He settled eventually in a town 2 territories over, where he kept a merchant's accounts, and was by all reports scrupulously honest as men sometimes become, when the currency they once traded in has been taken from them for good. Merrick kept his practice in the village. He did not need to be told twice ever again to treat whoever came to his door. He was a man who had needed his comfortable assumptions removed, and a boy of 6 had removed them for him in a single night. He became in time a better physician for it, and a braver one, and he never once forgot the child who climbed a hill and shamed him gently into being who he should have been all along. And when it was over, when the hall had emptied, Torvald found Marin in the corridor outside it, where she was stacking the last of the empty pitchers. Because she was still a maid. The trial had not changed that. The world does not rearrange itself in an afternoon, and Marin had never once in her life waited for it to. She turned when she heard him. She knew his footsteps. She'd stopped hating that she knew them. He stopped a few feet from her. That direct reading attention she'd first felt on an icy path. "You don't have to do that anymore," he said. "The pictures, any of it." "I know how to work," Marin said. "It's not the working I ever minded." "No," he said. "I don't imagine it was." The corridor was cold and quiet, and lit by 2 wall sconces that turned everything amber. And 6 years of invisible, careful, necessary smallness sat in Marin's chest, and waited to see what she would do with it. "Fenwick," she said, "you knew my mother's carving. You've never said how." So he told her. A boy of 15. A squall on the South Road. Lost half frozen, separated from his father's party. And a woman in a small house who took him in for an afternoon and gave him broth and a heel of bread, and never once asked who he was, or what his father might pay for it. Who had a newborn asleep in a basket by the fire. Who had a row of small carved birds on her mantel. "I never knew her name," Torvald said. "I was too cold and too proud and too 15 to ask. And by the time I was a man who might have gone back to thank her, Fenwick was empty. I told myself the debt had gone with it." He looked at her. And then a woman held out a loaf of bread on an icy path and would not apologize for it. And I saw a carved bird on a shelf. And I understood the debt hadn't gone anywhere at all. It had grown up. and gotten a brother, and come to clean my floors. Maren stood very still. "The baby in the basket," she said. "Was you?" Torvald said. "I'm nearly certain. I can't prove it with anything more than a carving and a color of eyes, and the way your mother apparently raised a daughter who feeds a child before herself when she's starving. But I'd stake a great deal on it." Something gave way in Maren's chest. Not loudly, not all at once. Just the quiet, structural settling of a wall that had stood a very long time, deciding at last that it no longer needed to. Because her whole life she had been the one who gave, who carried, who fed the child first, and went hungry, and asked for nothing, and expected less. And here was a man telling her that before she could even speak, before she could carry anyone anywhere, her mother's hands had already reached out and warmed a frightened stranger by a fire, that she came from that the giving had a source, and the source had a name she'd loved, and it had circled all the way back around through 15 years, and a squall and a loaf of bread, to find her standing in a corridor with a chin she'd learned to keep up. "My mother," she said, "would have said any decent person feeds a cold child, that it wasn't a debt, that it was just Tuesday." "I know," Torvald said. "That's exactly why it was a debt. The ones freely given always are." "Cassian wants to rebuild your North Tower," Maren said, because her eyes were stinging, and she needed suddenly to say a smaller thing. "He has opinions about load-bearing arches. He's 6. The corner of Torvald's mouth shifted. "I know. He's already delivered me 4 drawings. One came with a written note about the west wall." A pause. "He was right about it incidentally. It was rotten. He may have saved more than one life knowing which stone would hold." Maren looked at him. He looked at her. And she took a breath, and she said the thing she had said once before, on an icy path. Except this time, she said the whole of it. "The bread was for him," she said. "But I was hungry too." It was the truth this time. All of it. And he heard it the same way she had once heard his on that first cold night. Clean and whole. The sound of a thing finally said correctly, with nothing held back to keep it safe. "I know," he said quietly. "You don't have to be hungry here." Spring came to Corveth the way it always did, without announcement, without ceremony. Just the slow, stubborn insistence of warmth returning to stone that had been cold for months. The North Tower was still standing. Mostly. Though Cassian had produced by the count of the housekeeper, Gudrun, who kept track of such things, with the flat efficiency of a woman who had run the domestic staff longer than Maren had been alive, some 17 detailed drawings of what it might become. And Torvald reviewed each one with a genuine attention that Cassian found entirely appropriate, and that Maren found quietly extraordinary. Cassian grew as children do, faster than anyone was ready for. I became in time exactly what he had announced he would become. A builder, a designer, a young man with charcoal-stained hands and very strong opinions about load-bearing arches, and a habit which he never lost of watching the world with his hands, so he could remember what other people forgot. The North Tower was eventually his in the way projects belong to the people who love them most. He rebuilt it, the strong stone by the stairs, never the edge, and Maren, who had walked down an icy hill with stolen bread and held it out with steady hands, and told a lie with her chin up, and spent 6 years being invisible in a place that had not deserved her. Maren remained. Not as a maid. She kept the green wool shawl for years, because she was practical, and it was warm, and because a small kindness, once you learn where it came from, is worth holding on to. Not as a variable in anyone's ledger, not as a problem to be reassigned. She remained as herself, which was the thing she had guarded through all the cold years with such ferocious, quiet determination. The self that made bad jokes at the wrong moments, that carried children across valleys on nothing at all, that stood in doorways without apology, that could be starving and give the bread away anyhow, because her mother had done the same by a fire for a frightened boy and called it Tuesday. And Torvald, who had spent 11 years being a king and had done it well, found that being known by a person who had no reason to pretend, who saw him in the morning, before he'd arranged his face, who told him plainly when she disagreed, who laughed at things. He said 3 full seconds after he said them, which he came to understand was exactly the right amount of time, was a different thing entirely from being obeyed. Better, he thought. Harder, more real. The hold on the hill stopped looking like a threat from the road below. The house at the edge of this village stayed standing, its broken latch finally fixed by Cassian, who insisted who had opinions about hinges too. Its chimney never dark in winter again. And on cold nights, when the snow came down, soft and total, over the towers, and the hill, and the village, Maren would sometimes think of that first night. The bread still warm in her pocket. The footsteps behind her on the ice. The impossible, terrifying, life-changing luck of a powerful man who had chosen for once to follow the truth of a thing rather than the convenience of it. It was not in the end a story about a king's mercy. It was a story about a woman who survived everything that tried to make her small. And a man who had been powerful long enough to learn that power is not the rarest or the most valuable thing a person can offer another. It was a story about bread on a cold night. And what follows sometimes when someone looks at a person the world has taught itself to look straight through, and sees them whole.